Hi class. I know this is an unusual video, but we are living in unusual times. And for the most part, for the next 2 weeks, we're going to be talking to each other via the internet and not face to face. My hope is that we will ultimately go back to our normal routine. But in the interim, I'm going to be using this mechanism to communicate with you, also with Zoom for tutorials and just getting feedback and just communicating with you and providing you any information that I can to help you through these final chapters. Last time we talked about break-even points, all of that. How do we determine what our break-even is? How do we determine um, how to do how much products we're going to be producing, and giving real information on just whether or not we can manage profitability, and we could see in advance whether or not some product or service we will have to discontinue and why. This chapter really does get into some other types of costs that are relevant for short-term decisions. And remember, this is all short-term, 6 months, 1 year. So my hope in this chapter that you can kind of glean something from the previous chapter that will help you. We have to first of all start with what is relevant, and that's going to be critical because it's going to really guide whatever else we have to do. And we're going to also deal with some pricing issues. How do we determine the best price? And honestly, these principles are really important because it kind of gives you an idea of what Apple goes through and other organizations that sell a product, and how and why they charge as much as they do. I mean, there has to be a reason for this. There has to be a reason why a phone would cost me $800, other than just profit. I mean, truly. Also, we're going to also talk about the steps that are needed to accept a special order. Some organizations do have that capability. They have excess stock, and they may very well have to decide whether or not is advantageous for them to take that job or to leave that product where it is. Also, we will talk about the process by which a product is discontinued. What type of things that an organization will have to ask themselves and analyze to make that determination. And also talk about the product mix and some other constraints. I have to say that this chapter really is probably the least amount of computations. It's going to be gleaming on common sense and rational business decisions that have to be made. There are some calculations, but nothing to the extent of chapters 7 and 6 and 5 and 4. We're going to talk about outsourcing and what is outsourcing really, and why would we use it, and why would it be an alternative. And again, it's all about alternatives that best suits the needs of the organization. And also, finally, whether to sell a product as is or either continue processing. And we're going to take a numerical approach, I guess, when we talk about this. What's the computational type of things that are needed in order to really understand what kind of impact it will have on an organization. So, the information that you will need to make decisions. Think about your own life, really, and the things that you have to think about if you're going to buy a car, or if you're going to take this job or take another job, or do this or do that. There are things that you'll need in order to make that decision, to make an intelligent, informed decision. So in business, you have to think about, what are your goals? What kind of alternatives did you have? Should I do this or that? Should I stop this and add that, or vice versa? You get the information that you need in order to make that decision. And now again, it's all about judgment. So it's no right or wrong in this. It's more or less more information that you have, the better you have to make an informed choice in this case. And then you choose the choice. And then after you've made that choice, you go back and you think about what the alternatives was and what actually happened, and see whether or not the process made sense for you or worked, and then change, and then make addressing changes. So again, you implement your decision. You decide, this is the alternative I'm going to take. And then you have to go back and you have to think, well, did this work? Did I get what I planned on getting? Did I achieve the goal? And whatever that goal is. So it's really nothing outside of common sense. Nothing that you and I wouldn't do intuitively. We just basically put it on paper. So your alternative, what type of information that's relevant, that's necessary, that is absolutely important for you to use to make a decision. That's going to be relevant. Characteristic number 1 is going to be about future. It's going to be about alternatives. And again, everything that we do, mostly everything we do, we have choices. We can either do it or not do it. We can do this or do that. So we always have choices. And what's important is having relevant information so that you can choose effectively. You're not going to always choose the right choice. I mean, you're not going to always be right. But the most important thing is having the information that you need to make that choice and being able to evaluate it after the fact if that choice was the right one to make or the best one to make. So relevant information all depends on what you're trying to decide. If you're talking about determining whether or not you're going to have a product or a product discontinued or you're going to launch a new product, one would suspect you'll have to make certain that you can have in front of you your cost data. Very important. Not only your revenue data, because everybody knows about revenue. If I create this particular product for this cost and charge this much, we can kind of predict based on patterns what that revenue forecast would be. The clincher, I think, would be choosing other alternatives or evaluating other alternatives and matching those with what your goals are and seeing whether or not you should go forward or you should not. So we want to look at what operating income, and again, within a 1 year period. This is definitely a short-term way of looking at things. We're going to focus on our revenues. Obviously, we want to focus on our costs. And the difference between our revenues and our costs is going to be our profits. So that's very important. And remember, the contribution margin approach, which we talked about in the last chapter and how important it is, the contribution margin is going to be your gross sales minus your variable costs. And that's going to be quite important because everything that we're doing in this chapter is really assuming that you understand the relationship between your margin, your contribution margin, and your gross sales. So that's kind of important. So if you don't remember what contribution margin is or how to use that equation, go back to chapter 7 and review those computations. There were quite a number in that chapter, and so you may want to review that before going forward. So short-term decisions will include special orders, pricing, whether to discontinue a department or a store or even a product, which mixture of products that you want to sell, and whether or not outsourcing will work for your organization. Again, it's all about getting the highest profitability. And sometimes outsourcing can allow you to do that because you'll remove some costs you don't have to incur if you decide to let someone else do some of the work for you. Or whether you should package a product and fully process it or in stages. And it all depends on the organizations and their goals and what they're trying to achieve and how they think is best for that organization to achieve it. Now, we always want to avoid sunk costs. And again, sunk costs we've talked about in previous chapters. They are very relevant when we're talking about financial accounting, but they're not relevant in managerial accounting. And we know all about that. And so that's not something I would be worried about in this chapter. I would be concerned, however, is using unit costs that are just variable. We want to have a combination of fixed and variable costs. And we talked about how to separate the two in the previous chapters. And again, if you don't remember that, let's go back to chapter 6 when we were talking about the equation and determining how to, if you graph your costs and you don't know if it's fixed or variable, you can eyeball it and tell whether it's fixed or whether it has both fixed costs and variable costs. And you can also, using high-low method or using regression analysis, kind of back into what the fixed cost portion of that cost is and what the variable cost portion. And that's going to be kind of important because it serves as the background of what we're talking about in this chapter. So again, goals. The organization wants to establish goals because it's going to guide what they do. What are their goals? What are they trying to achieve? How do they believe they're going to achieve it? And the goals could be very, very organizational, or it could be departmental, or it could be geographical, or it could be product-based. The bottom line is we have to have some layer of goals that we have in place that it will help us narrowly define what our short-term goals are, our short-term objectives are, whether it be in pricing or etc. So in pricing decisions, what's going to be your target profit? And remember last chapter, we talked about finding out what the break-even point is. And the break-even in calculation is going to be the sales price minus the expenses when they both are the same, where you're not making a profit, but you're not losing money. that's an important computation, because that's going to say, well, if my break even is at this point, I need to calculate what my target profit is going to be. And if I have a target profit, how many sales do I need to have? How many products do I need to sell to get that target profit? Also, Apple is one company that would be concerned, what are customers willing to pay? So that $800 cell phone that you purchase may very well be 50% fixed and variable costs, and the remainder could very well be the profit. Why? Consumers are willing to pay. They're willing to pay that much money for a cell phone or iPad or any other type of device. So that's something very, very important. They want to know their target profit, but they also have to be very much aware of what people are willing to pay. And it's all about the economy. People have the willingness to pay for it. People have the desire to pay for it, but they have the money to pay for it, which would be quite different. So are we a price taker or a price setter? And here are some characteristics of each. And again, this chapter is more about concepts, about theories, and it assumes enough information about you understanding the contribution margin, how to calculate the break even, and understanding the relationship between your break even and your margin of safety. It assumes those types of things. So it goes a little bit further, and it talks it in conceptual terms. What are people looking for when they're looking at your product? What's our target profit or margin? Are we in a position of being a price taker, or we're a price setter? And so that's again about pricing decisions. And again, this chapter is very, very straightforward, because if you think about it in your own personal life, we are not price setters. We're basically price takers. But in some cases, we can look and see what are we willing to buy, and how much are we willing to spend for that item. And we look for products that meet that need, and we look at alternatives, and we decide this one or that based on some criteria that we already have. This is exactly the same for a business. It's exactly the same. We go through a process by which we want to make certain that it's the best for us. We may need something, but we may have a process by which we decide from this alternative or to another alternative, and why. Companies do the exact same thing. The only difference in this context is we're using accounting vernacular. But every day you and I make these alternatives. Every day we choose whether or not we're going to do something or not, or whether we're going to spend on that, or whether or not we're going to buy a car outright or finance it, or we're going to finance with this organization. And we think about price, we think about cost, we think about revenues. We think about this all the time. We use that information in our minds when we're creating our budget of where we want to be in the next 6 months or a year. So we do this. This is not something we don't do. We do it all the time. What I want you to see in this chapter is that it's a natural extension of what you already do. You already cost plus. You already know if you're in business personally and you have to sell a product, you think about it. You don't really think about accounting and all of that, but you think about it. It cost me this much to manufacture or to create this product for this person. I want to have X amount of dollars return on that money. Same here. This is called cost plus pricing. You may not give it a term when you're thinking about it, but in reality, this is exactly how you're thinking. So when we are talking about cost plus pricing, we're talking about the total cost plus the profit that we want to derive. And here are examples of how that number is calculated. And again, we don't want to get into the calculation so much. We want to understand what's happening and why it's happening and what it means. Cost plus pricing, and why is it particularly relevant for some situations and not necessarily so for others. That's more important than computation, simply because you can always look at your textbook and go through the computation, but the why of it and the how of it and how you put it all together to make a decision is far more important. So looking at these examples will be helpful in homework, but I want you to really get in this chapter about the thought process that organizations and their finance team put together so that they can make a decision, and why decisions are made in the way that they're made. Sometimes they don't make any sense to us. We are consumers. We want to buy this product, but all of a sudden this product is limited, or this product is very, very expensive and I can't afford to get it, so I have to find other alternatives. You can think about what is involved in that. This particular product may very well be a high-end product, and it may be very expensive to manufacture, and you have to think about that. What are people willing to buy, and how much are they willing to pay for it? finding out that is going to be, I think, the biggest hurdle for any organization when they're launching a new product. But when the product has been around for a while, they have a good idea of how to price it. It really becomes important to be aware of the market conditions. And organizations that bring a new product, they have focus groups and they test it because it gives them a safe way to launch a product without really putting themselves in a situation where they may lose money. Is the price too high? Is the price too low? Individuals can give you real feedback. Big organizations do this. Small organizations may not have the manpower to do this, but I would venture to guess Apple and other major manufacturers can use this mechanism by which to test it to see if it's going to work before they do a full launch. They call it a test run, and it's a very good idea to do if you can afford to do it. So target costing, it starts with the market price, which is what people are willing to pay for it, and it subtracts out its desired profit. What you want to find out is what is your target cost? What is your total target cost? And again, it's when an organization really wants to get and break down the numbers, this is not something that you're going to see on financial statements. This is not something that you're going to see in the notes to the financial statements. This is really micro analyzation of financial accounting. I mean, it's really digging deep into the numbers and drilling down past the gross sales amount that appears on the financial statements. It really digs into the nitty gritty, basically. And this is important. Target costing can be done really by product. It can be done as a whole for the whole of the product line. It can be done by specific products. Again, it's all about what the organization's goals are and can they attain those goals. And being as specific as possible and having extremely relevant cost information, organizations can pretty much dead on target what their costs are going to be and how much they're willing to keep that cost at that level. And if there are any wiggle room in terms of reducing those costs. How can you reduce costs? How can you reduce your variable costs? How can you make your product different and differentiate it? And how can you lower your profit if you had to? If you were in a situation where you had to lower your profit, how low can it go before it becomes an issue where you have to consider discontinuing the product? So the calculations in this chapter are all along that line. What you're trying to do is trying to figure out what can you accept and what can you logically reject in terms of target costing or target your revenue, your projections. Are you able to attain that based on the data that you have? So it becomes very important to have relevant data that's absolutely current. You're talking about short-term decisions, pricing decisions. You've got to have relevant information and it has to be extremely current. Otherwise, you're going to be making a day's decision based on yesterday's information. And everybody knows that's a recipe for disaster. So when you have excess capacity. What do you do with that excess capacity? Is it in your advantage? Is it to your advantage to do a special order? And those are the kinds of questions that some companies will have to ask. If I have excess, what do I want to do with it? Is it cost effective for me to do this special order? And again, you have to think about that. So let's think about whether we do or whether we don't, and then ultimately discuss the why. So in this analysis, the special order, they have to calculate what that revenue would be based on that special order. They have to consider all of their expenses, their variable expenses, and what their contribution margin is, not only in terms of a unit, but also in dollars. And you can see that your contribution margin by unit is going to be your sales price per unit minus your variable cost by unit, which equals your contribution margin by unit. Conversely, your contribution margin in dollars is going to be your revenues in dollars minus your variable expenses in dollars, which equals your contribution margin in dollars. And these are computations that we reviewed in chapter 7, but I want to go over them again because, again, these are the computations that's going to keep following us. It's going to follow us, I believe, in chapter 9 as well. So think about those computations, and if you have any questions or any difficulties remembering them, go back to that chapter and review those computations again. They're not complex. It's just that that chapter had at least 10 computations, separate and distinct, and the volume of computations outweighs the complexity of those computations, and sometimes remembering them might not be as easy. So if you want to go back, by all means, go back and review the computation for contribution margin, both in dollars and in units. Review the computation for the calculation of the gross, the break-even point in dollars and in units, and also go over the margin of safety, computation for the margin of safety, and the computation related to the target revenue or the target profit in that chapter. Very, very useful information, which you will most likely see in this chapter, but also expanded upon in a little bit more. So the decision rule, should we accept it? Should we not? And again, it's not, it is not a very difficult decision to make, because if you think about it in terms of your own personal finance, should you do it or not? You got to think, is it going to exceed my cost? If this revenue, if this benefit to me or to my organization is going to exceed the cost, I think it's worthy of me to accept that. If it's not, then I know I'm not going to accept it. Very, very basic and very, very straightforward. Something that you and I do all the time. We may not necessarily put words and concepts and accounting, all of that in it, but when it comes down to it, if it's going to benefit me more than it costs me, I'm going to rightfully consider doing it. And if it doesn't, I'm not going to do it. And the kind of company has the same logic. So we do this all the time. That's why I like this chapter, because this chapter really brings together the common sense of accounting. People get a little bit more involved with accounting because they think it's all GAAP and all these rules and all of that. But part of accounting is really using basic practical information in such a way that you can make a very responsible decision, not just for today, but also for a year, and in some cases long term. So that's what I love about this chapter. I think it's not hard to understand it. It's so practical, and everybody can do it, and everybody has been doing it. All adults have done it. We do it all the time. We do it without thinking. We make decisions on whether we do or we don't, and we use available information to do it. And we weigh it, and we go back and we say, this is the right decision I made, and I did well. Or this decision wasn't the best, but I did it with available information, and this is what I've learned from it. Again, we'd all do it. So whether to discontinue. When we are thinking about discontinuing a product, chances are the product is not doing very well. It could very well be doing well in one geographic location and doing very poorly in another. And an organization has to come to the point where they have to say, we have to think about this logically. What are we going to do about this product? What are we going to do about this department or this store? We have to look at the numbers. Is it worth us continuing it? What would happen hypothetically if we were to discontinue it? What would happen to our profit margin? What would happen to our organizational financial statements? And those questions are very good questions to ask. Long before you make the decision to discontinue, can you do a pro forma financial statement and see what it would look like if that particular unit, product, or service was discontinued? If we just removed it out completely, what would our financial statements look like? And that's very, very important information. And you do the same thing. I mean, I'm trying to think about my situation. What if I discontinued going to a hairstylist every 2 weeks? What would be the impact? I mean, I'm using this something really silly, but if you think about what would be the impact, okay, obviously I will pay less money. I would have less money going out the door. That's the obvious answer. But then what would be the other types of things that I have to consider that are not necessarily financial, but maybe more emotional, or maybe something more feeling good about yourself, or whatever the reason why you do what you do. The same thing would be true for an organization. They're going to say, I'm going to stop this particular service, and I want to know what it would look like. I want you to take all of the numbers, all of the financial numbers, all of the revenue and the expenses that relate to this particular operation, and remove it from our financial statements and see what it would look like. How would it impact our profitability overall? And that's what this particular section is all about. And here's an example I think would be kind of interesting to see. This is the organization. Here are their product lines, and there's their total. They have to think about what kind of costs would be avoided if they removed it, and what kind of costs are going to be there no matter what. And having that makes it very, very important, because that's going to help you determine if your contribution margin is going to be positive or negative. It's going to really be important to note that. So if they're going to take one of their units and remove it, they can remove some of the avoidable costs and come up with what their organization's new profit or contribution margin would be, considering those avoidable costs. So if the moisturizer was continued, that's what their operating income would be lost if they did that. And again, this is all what we do all the time. We do it in lots of situations. We are not, we think about, if I were to stop doing this or that, what would be the impact? And sometimes the impact is financial. Sometimes the impact is emotional. Sometimes the impact is more just a matter of convenience. Something is more convenient may be costly for you. And by not doing it, you have to do a little bit more work, but you save a little bit more money, and you have to think about it. I'm dealing with the convenience issue, but I'm paying more money. I think I'm just going to have to do that the long way, because the money that I'm saving is far more beneficial to me in my personal situation. So I'm going to do this. And that's what basically this particular chapter is talking about in essence. How can we make decisions? What's going to be the impact of that decision if we were to do it? It's kind of like saying, if I did this, then what? And organizations do it all the time. So I would think, as you're reading this chapter, think about the decision rules. Think about the kinds of things that are common sense that you and I would think about in our personal finances. If we were to stop doing something, what would be the impact? Sometimes the impact is absolutely emotional, or sometimes it's financial and emotional, and having to be able to separate the two of those. Sometimes it's purely a matter of convenience and money. Think about that. So these decision-making processes are very similar to what we would do every single day in our life. So when you're thinking about discontinuing, think about why an organization would consider something as serious, as grave as discontinuing a particular store or a particular brand. It affects employees. Again, you think about, you're gonna have to terminate people. You're gonna have to close down a shop. You're gonna have to continue to pay the rent if you're in a rent situation. Think about that. So don't think about just what the income statement effect will be, but think about how those costs are going to affect or other areas of the operation, because fixed costs are going to be there no matter what. And if you take all of these different product lines and you take in the cost of fixed costs that's being spread to all of those, if you take out one piece, the other pieces that remain are going to have to bear a larger portion of that fixed cost, which could very well have a profitability impact. So it's more than just look at the numbers. So think about the product mix. Think about the type of things you need to consider when you want to put out a product for sale, and what is going to be your constraint. What are the constraints that you'll have to deal with? And dealing with those kinds of things really does have to do with an organization understanding what products they provide, understanding the customers that they provide it to, and also the costs associated with that. Understanding the trends and the economics of the environment, the economy at the time is going to be important. So when you're considering the appropriate product mix, think about who wants your product. Are they teens? Are they millennials? Are they adults? Are they for children? Think about the product mix and what type of things that they're looking for and the costs associated with those products. What products that would be best sold together, and what products, if you take one away, what would be obviously the impact to another product, a complementary product. Are there complementary products in the marketplace? And if I remove mine, what would be the impact of my other products that I'm selling? Again, product mix decisions, very, very important. And you have to consider those. Again, I think this chapter is very, very easy to understand, because it deals with all the issues and problems and issues and goals that you and I as individuals face all the time. Not necessarily on a grand scale as an organization, but we are always considering alternatives. We're always considering costs and how we can control those costs. And we're always considering whether to do something or not and what the impact would be. And that really determines whether or not we make that decision or not. So think about all of those and consider the constraints and see how those constraints kind of in some way are relative to what you do with your own personal decision-making process. So, in a final few minutes, I want to talk about outsourcing. Outsourcing is a big deal and it's sometimes controversial, but what organizations try to do is what can we do to minimize costs? How can we control costs in such a way that we can maintain a level of profitability that's sufficient for our organization? Outsourcing is when a company decides to contract outside for a product. Apple may use vendors that are located in China. Offshore is also working not in your domestic country, but into another country. And Nissan does this. Volkswagen does this because they come from Germany and they come over to the US and they manufacture their automobiles. So offshoring is a little different from outsourcing, and what I would like for all of you to do is to know the difference and what types of considerations that are necessary for both of those types of decisions. And I don't like to keep this video too long, so I will say in chapter 8 and chapter 9, you will find that you'll see that there are more concept level type of data in these chapters and not so much computational, and some of the computations you've already done before, so I don't believe there's anything new in these computations that you'll see in this chapter or in the next. But just remember, if you need to go back to chapter 8 and go back to chapter 7 and chapter 6, please do so. It will make this chapter much easier to get through. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hopefully will talk to you in class. Bye.